Got late. This is chapter 8. January 1st, 2003, New Year's Day. Detective John Bauer spent much of the New Year's Day 2003 on the road, driving to and from Madeira. Bueller had been officially appointed to handle Amber Frey, and it was a good choice for many reasons. Bueller was kind, eager, and enthusiastic. He was also divorced, which meant he didn't have a wife at home to feel uneasy about the many phone calls he would be receiving from the attractive but very needy young woman. Bueller's assignment would require a lot of hand-holding. In the coming weeks, his phone would ring repeatedly, interrupting precious time with his son and daughter. But in the end, his efforts did not go unappreciated by the woman who bravely stepped in to help solve the case. Bueller was not the only officer whose private life came to a grinding halt when Lacey went missing. Detectives followed up on countless leads that arose during the almost 2-year investigation. There were calls from people saying that Lacey had been taken for her unborn child. Others from psychics purporting to have visions of the missing woman in various locations, and still more from tipsters anxious to report sightings of a pregnant woman fitting Lacey's description. The calls came in from all over the country. One fact that was ignored by the press is the 6 detectives on the case were juggling 34 other homicides at that time. Many of them had missed holidays with their families, and in some cases, their long absences created problems at home. The personal sacrifices made by Detective Grogan, District Attorney Investigator Stephen Bertolato, and Prosecutor Rick Distasso, and Dave Harris, all of whom have young children, were enormous. Bueller arrived at Amber Fry's residence around 1:30 p.m. to take custody of the tapes of the previous night's conversation. Once inside, Amber told Detective Bueller that Scott preferred that she send mail to a post office box while he was overseas. Somehow, he claimed, he would be able to access the letters through his email. Amber didn't think that made sense, but she jotted down the address anyway. Scott Peterson, P.O. Box 290, 1811 H Street, Suite B5, Modesto, California. Later that day, Amber listened to Scott as he shared more stories of his supposed European adventures. Now he was in Brussels, about to take a morning jog over the quaint cobblestone streets. All the French food and wine was making him pudgy, he claimed. And last night, well, this morning too, there is a fucking dog next to this hotel, Scott said. This what? The dog, he just keeps barking. I want to kill it, he snapped. The dog, of course, was Mackenzie. He switched subjects. I got here like at 2 o'clock this morning, and I'm going to fight the pudge. So you're going jogging at 7 o'clock in the morning? It is so cold outside, Scott told her. It is freezing. There is no snow on the ground, but it was so cold last night. So, how long distance are you going? Are you just gonna jog the streets, or? Amber asked. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just gonna run. I kind of remember the area here, Scott said. I'll jog down to the main square, which is kind of neat with all the big churches in the background. Yeah, I don't even really, the only times I've really seen Paris is, Amber struggled to get the words out. I'm in Brussels now, Scott corrected her. Oh, that's right. You did the change at Brussels. You're in Europe, though, right? Amber queried. Oh, yeah, Scott confirmed. Scott attempted to explain the time difference to Amber. While she was getting ready to turn in for the night, he was already starting a new day. Where he was, he said, it was 9 hours ahead of Madeira. Yeah, that's just so confusing to me, Amber giggled. And I hope by the time, by the end of this month, I'll finally get the hang of it. And then I'll be back, and then we won't have to worry about it again, Scott told her. Even now, the investigation heating up around him, Scott was still convinced that he had nothing to fear. Just as he told Amber weeks before, he thought that he would be free by the close of January. Did he think detectives would simply quit when Lacey's body did not turn up, or was he convinced that he had already won the game? Right, Amber agreed. Okay, so you got to go to bed, huh? Yeah, I'm just jabbering now. Okay, good night, sweetie, Scott said. I'll talk to you maybe tomorrow, okay? Amber hung up the phone knowing that Scott was only 90 minutes away. Over the next several days, Scott's employers confirmed the detective's suspicions. In a phone interview from Madrid, his boss, Eric Van Innes, said that he hadn't seen Scott on December 14th. That was the day he told Lacey he had to pick up his boss in San Francisco, a lie to cover his date with Amber at her Christmas formal. Van Innes told the police that the last time he'd come to the United States was in January or February 2002 when he flew into San Francisco Airport from Mexico. Another executive from Trade Corp, Nuno Loureiro, 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 member of the company's board, told police he received an email from Scott on December 26 relating that his wife was missing and he was assisting law enforcement in looking for her. In the email, Scott stated that he would need to take a few days off. Scott didn't seem to think that the case would need much time from his busy schedule. After receiving this message, Loureiro spoke to Scott twice by phone. Scott explained to his boss that his wife had gone for a walk with their dog on December 24, 2002. He said that someone may have seen her in a parking lot and mentioned that a nearby home had been burglarized. It was all very matter of fact. Loureiro agreed to cooperate with the investigation and promised not to mention their conversation or that fact that police intended to review the company records. Grogan, meanwhile, was alerted to a rumor that Laci Peterson may have been involved in an affair of her own. The rumor was bolstered by a second source, a caller to the Laci Peterson tip line, who stated that the expectant mother was dating a personal trainer from her gym. A third tip came in by email that same morning, also indicating that Lacey was dating another man. Grogan turned the information over to Detective Bertolato of the district attorney's office and asked him to follow up. It is not unusual for such allegations to arise in a case of this sort, but no evidence was ever found to substantiate these claims. As he delegated duties, Grogan's cell phone vibrated. It was Scott, asking for the keys to his home and business and requesting access to some business checks he said were in the glove box of his truck. He needed to deposit those checks, he said, in order to make payroll. Grogan told Scott that he would make such inquiries. He called Scott back about an hour later and asked him and let him know that the keys would be at the reception desk at the headquarters after 1:30 p.m. He then moved quickly to get a court-approved GPS tracking system installed on Lacey's Land Rover before returning it. This would allow the police to survey Scott's movements without him knowing it. Grogan called back to alert Scott that the police intended to release photos of his vehicle and boat in the attempt to verify his trip to the Berkeley Marina on December 24th. When Scott didn't answer, he left a detailed voicemail. To Scott, it was all part of the game. Threatening him with pictures was just Grogan's way of trying to get a rise out of him. 2 hours later, Scott Peterson made the next move. Striding into the lobby of the police station, he requested to speak to Grogan. Moments later, the stocky detective greeted him with a firm handshake and presented Scott with his wallet. In his hand, he held Scott's keys. Given Scott's previous concern about inventory receipts, he forestalled any challenge by reviewing each key carefully and returning them one by one. He did not mention that the police had made copies. Get him. Grogan intended to keep the keys to Scott's 2002 Ford pickup and the toolbox in the truck's rear and the remote to his car alarm. Scott nodded and then told Grogan he needed to retrieve 2 business checks from his truck. He also asked if police had taken any checks from his business office. Grogan told him no, but explained that a number of Scott's business records had been seized as part of the search warrant. Scott requested that Grogan find out which checks police had taken as evidence and arrange for their return. Grogan told him that he could not release them without a court order. Scott pressed the detective, telling him that it would be helpful if he could pay his employees, and instructed Grogan to do what he could to get them released. I told Scott I feel that he may have more time to contact the businesses who wrote the checks and have those checks stopped and new ones issued rather than to have me stop working on the investigation of his missing wife to write court orders. Grogan wrote. Seeming to back off a bit, Scott said, "Sure, you're right. You should be working on the case." It was Scott's move. If Grogan wasn't going to give him the checks, then he wasn't going to give the detectives his debit card. Instead, he pulled out a piece of paper that read, Chevron Parthenon, Livermore, 932498575, $13.08. He had downloaded the receipt from the internet rather than to let the detective have his card to collect the information. Changing the subject back to his wife, Scott asked if Grogan believed that Lacey was kidnapped for the baby. "Do you think when she has the baby, I'll get half of my family back?" Scott asked flatly. Just reading that question sends chills up my spine. I told Scott that we had investigated any leads with similar themes. However, I found the probability that Lacey was kidnapped for the baby to be unlikely, Grogan logged in his daily report. I also explained to him that we had asked all local law enforcement agencies to notify Modesto Police Department regarding any calls from hospitals about infants who were accompanied by females that do not medically appear likely to be the child's mother. Scott next asked the detective if he thought that Lacey had died. I told Scott that with each passing day, the likelihood that Lacey would be returned unharmed diminished, Grogan wrote. Then at last, Scott appeared to have tears welling in his eyes, the detective noted. But Scott did not cry, and I did not hear him sniffling. At 5:30 that afternoon, there was an apparent break in the case. Detective George Stow and Sir Sebron Banks went into the briefing about the burglary that occurred at 516 Covina Avenue. An anonymous tipster had informed Detective Stow that items stolen from the Medina home and one of the men who allegedly pulled off the burglary were at the house on Tenya, Tenya, Tenaya, Tenya Avenue. The caller also stated that additional property taken during the heist was at a second residence on the same block. At 6 p.m., police knocked on the door of the 1406 Tenya Avenue. A woman answered and told police she had lived at the residence. Inside, the officers saw several small children. Officer Hicks told the woman that he had followed up on the burglary and asked if he could speak with her further. She invited him in. The officers explained that they had received information that led them to believe that items stolen from a nearby house were in her residence. The woman gave the police permission to search the premises and signed a search warrant waiver. While the search was underway, 42-year-old Donald Pierce rolled into the driveway. A background check of the home's residents prior to arriving on the scene revealed that Pierce had an outstanding traffic warrant from a neighborhood San Bernardino County. Officers standing in the driveway placed him under arrest. Pierce told the investigators that he had resided with his mother in her home on Tenya Avenue for the past 16 years. He was unemployed and worked on cars in his mother's driveway for income. He explained that he was the primary caregiver of his two young children. They lived in the main house with his mother, while he resided in the trailer in the back. Another man, Stephen Wayne Todd, also lived in a shed in his mother's backyard. When asked about the burglary on Covina Avenue, Pierce revealed these unreported details. On the morning of December 26, 2002, Stephen Todd came into his trailer between the hours of 6:30 and 7 o'clock. He told Pierce that he had been inside the home all night and that there was now a safe sitting on the home's front porch. Todd told him that he needed a vehicle to transport the heavy safe back to his shed. According to Pierce, the two men climbed into his four-door white truck, drove to 516 Covina, and used a dolly to transport the very large cream-colored safe to their vehicle. Pierce described how Todd had shoved the safe into the front seat and closed the passenger door, and then climbed in the rear passenger side, leaving the dolly on the grass near the curb. The two drove back to their place on Tenya, and then they carried the safe, which Pierce said weighed about 250 pounds, to Todd's shed. The safe was so heavy that at some point they dropped it and wound up rolling it to the front door of Todd's room. Todd retrieved a sledgehammer and other prying tools and pounded on the safe dial until it caved in and the door popped open. Inside there were two blue money bags, a box of jewelry, and a Tech-9 handgun, accompanied by a very large magazine of bullets. Pierce told Todd that he would get rid of the gun. A second gun was also among the stolen goods. The two men sifted through the jewelry and then looked inside the blue money bags. They were empty, Pierce claimed. Susan Medina told the police they contained $5,000 in cash, but Pierce said that the jewelry and the handguns were the only items of value in the safe. The piece included a woman's gold and emerald ring, a jade and gold ring, a woman's diamond wedding set, ruby earrings, and miscellaneous rings and necklaces containing precious gems. When the police located Todd, he admitted to committing the burglary. He said that he was on a bicycle at the time, but told police that he had nothing to do with the woman. When the officers asked him to clarify, he said that he was referring to the missing woman with the baby. Sorry. Todd was no stranger to the arresting officers. He had been booked on similar charges in the past. He claimed that he had sold most of the jewelry and one of the handguns to a relative of a friend and gave the rest of the pieces away to two female friends. As for the tools stolen from the shed, he sold them at a swap meet that past Saturday. During a later interview with the cops, Pierce admitted to selling the second gun for $200. Both men were booked into the Stanislaus County Jail. The detectives never believed that Todd and Pierce had any involvement with Lacey's disappearance. After the two men submitted to polygraphs later in the day, the police issued a press release stating that the burglary and Lacey's disappearance were in no way connected. Todd later pleaded guilty to one burglary charge and received an 8-year sentence. Pierce pleaded no contest to a lesser charge and got 130 days. The police were still receiving reports from the Red Lion Hotel. Sergeant Ed Steele, the police liaison assigned to Laci Peterson's family, recalled that on the night of December 30th, 2002, around 7:30 or 8 p.m., Scott Peterson had returned to the hotel and sat down in a chair and began sobbing. Several of Lacey's friends noticed his outburst and jumped up to confront him. Scott's crying jag lasted for about 30 minutes. He then got up and helped himself to food donated by the local restaurants for the search teams. Sergeant Steele advised that Scott had no apparent loss of appetite, and based on his breakdown earlier, he found it odd that he was able to eat within such a short time. Grogan responded. Grogan's next move was to leave Scott a voicemail message telling him that the Land Rover was ready to be picked up. He didn't say that he intended to ask Scott for DNA samples or that he would present evidence of his affair with Amber Fry. All of the information that I have provided Scott Peterson was true, Grogan noted in his report. However, I didn't plan to return the vehicle with the tracking device installed in it And I also plan to serve a search warrant completed by Detective Al Brockney for blood, cheek cell samples, hair samples, and a full body photographs. Scott called Grogan back and said that he would swing by headquarters in about half an hour to pick up the Land Rover. Hey, I heard about the robbery. Did we get any lead out on those guys? Scott asked. Well, we got all the burglars in custody, and we're working on clearing those guys now. And they just appear to be a bunch of burglars, Grogan stated. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing. They're with us now, and we're working on that angle of it. But it's not like, any of them have been arrested for some heinous thing in the past or something. Yeah, I just hope they saw something, Scott told the detective. A little while later, Scott arrived at the detective division with his father. Grogan met the men in the lobby and gave Scott the keys to his wife's SUV. He then asked if he could show him something. Scott consented. He and Lee started walking toward the interview room in the Investigative Services building. Grogan motioned for Lee Peterson to remain behind, advising that he wanted to meet Scott alone. I was looking into the Chris Watts case again. You can see the similarities of Chris Watts' parents and Scott Peterson's parents. But even this detective work, I'm like, it's that easy. I wish they had been little mistress, just leave your father in the fucking waiting room like a normal person. Whatever. Grogan motioned for Lee Peterson to remain behind, advising that he wanted to meet Scott alone. You're free to leave, and you don't have to talk to me if you don't want to, Grogan advised Scott that as they entered the small, well-lit room. Most of what happened next has never been reported in the press. Scott sat down. He watched as the detective produced a photocopy of a fax the police had received. It was the photo of Scott and Amber posing at the Christmas formal that Amber's mother had sent over the night before. Grogan had other better photographs of Scott and Amber in his possession, but decided not to produce them. Instead, he simply said that the police had received a copy of one fax photograph sent in anonymously. Looking directly at Scott, he slid the grainy black and white fax across the table. Can you explain this? Is that supposed to be me? Scott asked impassively. It looks like you. Scott insisted that the man in the picture was not him. It wasn't. Nor did he recognize the woman. Was this another stalling tactic? Why else would he deny this, when police would surely be able to confirm it? Are you certain you have never seen her before? Grogan asked. Scott said she resembled a girl he once knew in college. Changing the subject, Grogan told Scott about the burglary investigation. Both men had taken polygraph exams and passed, he said. The police were certain that the suspects in custody had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance. Good, Scott said. The detective then asked about some of the items that the police had taken from his house and business during the searches. When Grogan wanted to know, did Scott make the anchor for his boat? Again, Scott told me it was Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. Prior to Lacey's disappearance, Grogan recorded. I asked Scott where he purchased the bag of cement, and he told me he bought it at the Home Depot. and once he had made the anchor, he just threw the bag away. I asked how large a bag he made, and he held his hands apart, the distance approximately 2 feet, indicating the approximate size of a 90-pound cement bag. I asked Scott why he chose to make an anchor out of the cement rather than buy an anchor from the store. He told me a bag of cement cost approximately $3 in the store, and an anchor would cost $30 or more to purchase. Scott looked at several boats on December 9th before buying the nicest, most expensive one. His other activities, like wining and dining Amber Fry, did not support the notion that he would make some puny concrete weight to take to the bay rather than spending just $30 on a good substantial anchor. I told Scott I had never seen a cement anchor previously and asked where he had gotten the idea. Scott told me he had seen them in rental boats in the San Diego area in the past and believed that they would be easy to make. Scott told me the standard anchor is called a Danforth, but a mushroom anchor was the type of boat when he first viewed it. But a mushroom anchor was the type on the boat when he first viewed it. Scott said the owner of the boat did not want to sell the anchor, so Scott decided to make his own. I asked Scott if he looked at any other boats. Scott said he looked into 2 other boats on the Modesto Bee online. Scott again confirmed that Lacey was the only person who was aware that he had planned to purchase the boat. She did not go with him to look at the boats, as she had no real interest in them, Grogan later wrote. I explained to Scott that in reviewing my report and Detective Brockney's report, I saw a difference in his statement. I asked Scott to confirm when he first saw Mackenzie on 12/24/2002, after returning home from fishing. Scott confirmed that he first saw Mackenzie when he arrived home, prior to entering the house. I asked Scott why he had put the umbrellas in the back of his truck. Scott said he had wrapped them up in a tarp to take them to the shop, but had forgot to take them out on 2 of the occasions. I asked Scott where their current location was, and he told me he had taken them out of the vehicle and put them in a shed behind his house. Eventually, however, Scott began to bristle. When Grogan started asking Scott about the tarp he had moved from the truck to the shed, he wrote, Scott said, "I don't know if it's appropriate I'm talking to you without my attorney, Mr. McAllister." I told Scott that was fine, but I wanted to explain one thing to him. Grogan recorded what he told Scott next. I was aware he was a young man with a job requiring his travel, and he was a good-looking guy that would have no difficulty meeting women. I told Scott if there had been infidelities in his marriage, it would not necessarily mean he had done anything wrong to Lacey, and that he should tell me if he had been seeing other girls. Scott said the last time he dated anyone aside from Lacey was prior to his marriage to her. Even as Grogan was having this conversation, police were learning that Amber was not the only woman claiming an intimate relationship with Scott while he was married to Lacey. At that moment, Scott's ex-girlfriend, Janet Eyes, was on the phone with one of Grogan's assistants describing her 1998 affair with Scott while the two attended Cal Poly. Eyes, the woman who had walked in on Scott and Lacey in bed together, had finally called the police to share that story. Although what she and Brockney discussed was not admitted at trial, it helped fill in the detective's portrait of Scott Peterson. One detail Janet shared with the police was that Scott liked to hunt and fish. She knew he had been to Lake Lopez and Lake San Antonio, both freshwater locations. But as far as she knew, he never fished in saltwater. She was also not aware of any other women Scott dated that year, and admitted she avoided him after their confrontation. She also knew that Scott owned the shack. The only time she'd gone there, she spotted him and left immediately. Janet also told the police she was a vegetarian and that while they were dating, Scott had stopped eating meat. A statement that corroborated Amber's story about Scott becoming a vegan for some girlfriend because the sex was great. I asked Janet about their intimate relationship, Brockney later wrote. Janet said he had issues. It's tough stuff. Tough stuffs. Janet said Scott Peterson did some weird things at the bar after they broke up. It was only secondhand information from Peterson's roommates, however. Janet heard Peterson got real drunk and began exposing his penis at the bar. Janet said Scott Peterson was very self-conscious about the size of his penis. Remember, Scott Peterson's like a tall guy. He's self-conscious because his proportions are not living up to his expectations. All right. Where was I? Janet said Scott Peterson was very self-conscious about the size of his penis. He seemed concerned as to whether he could please a woman. Size did appear to be an issue for Scott Peterson. While investigating the case, I learned that he had developed names for Brockney and Grogan that suggested a fixation with sexual performance. Sources close to the investigation told me that Scott role-played a cross-examination of the two detectives, addressing them as half-pints, runts, little 5-foot nothings, and pricks. His questions were wildly immature, focusing on the size of their penises and their sexual abilities. Janet Ives told Brockney that Scott had expressed a desire to meet her family and friends, and he rarely talked about his own family. Janet said her friends all liked Scott, and she had never introduced him to her dad. She said her father does not like people who are slick, Brockney noted. He's a con man, a salesman. We notice. She said her father does not like people who are slick, Brockney noted. Janet told me Peterson thinks he is real smooth. Still, Janet had not been in love with Scott. She still had photos, gifts, jewelry, and clothes Scott had given her. I asked Janet how sure she was that Lacey knew Peterson was in an intimate relationship with her after the bedroom incident, Brockney wrote. Janet said that she had made it obvious to Lacey that Scott and Janice were in an intimate relationship. Checking the dates, the detective realized that Scott and Lacey had been married for less than a year when Scott began his affair with Janet. Poor Lacey. In the coming weeks, Janet Ives would continue to cooperate with police, sending them a package containing a necklace Scott had given her and the photos from the time that they were dating. She enclosed 6 color pictures, including one of Mackenzie at Janet's house, a snapshot of Scott relaxing beside Janet's coffee table, and one of Janet posing with 12 dozen roses Scott had presented her on their first date. Love bombing. In an accompanying letter, Janet explained that she often kept a handful of photos. She had angrily thrown the rest away after their breakup. In a moment reminiscent of Monica Lewinsky, Janet would later forward Brockney a black Hugo Buscati dress that Scott had given her as additional proof of their relationship. Looking for more insight into this period of Scott's life, Detective Brockney also interviewed housemates of Scott's, but Robert Aguirre had little to offer. Robert Aguirre had not known Scott before he moved into the house in 1998, and even after he moved in, Scott revealed little about himself. It wasn't until 3 weeks after Scott moved in that Lacey called the house, and Robert Aguirre discovered that Scott was married. During this time, Robert Aguirre said Scott associated with other women than Lacey, but he could not or would not say whether Scott had been sexually involved with any of them. He described Scott more as a big brother than a peer. Robert Aguirre told the detective that there were many nights during college when women stayed over at the house. When pressed further, he simply said that he couldn't recall specifics. The specific women who spent the night with Scott. Even after Brockney showed him a photo of Scott arm in arm with Janet Ives, Robert Aguirre said that he would not and could not recall this woman spending the night with his roommate. Fuck the boys club. That is awful. Somebody is missing, Robert Aguirre. Get your shit together. Brockney then asked if he could remember any woman discovering Scott and Lacey in bed together. It could have happened, Robert Aguirre told the detective. I just don't remember. As the conversation between Scott and Detective Grogan drew to a close, the detective asked Scott to consent to a collection of blood and DNA evidence and of full-body photographs. Scott replied that he was sure that the detective had a search warrant for this. When Grogan produced the search warrant, Scott did not read it. He simply went along without further comment. Scott was fingerprinted and photographed that afternoon, and technicians also collected cells from the inside of his cheek for DNA testing. Detective Bueller soon joined Scott and Grogan, and together the three drove to Doctor's Medical Center to draw blood samples. During the 20-minute ride, Scott sat up front next to Bueller. Grogan sat in the back seat and listened. Unbeknownst to Scott, a tape recorder was capturing his remarks about his mother in ill health, snowboarding, his wife's Land Rover, and the detectives working overtime. Once at the hospital, the technicians the technicians took about 15 minutes to collect blood samples from Scott. During the return trip, Grogan asked Scott if he had talked to his attorney about taking a polygraph. Yeah, Scott replied. What's his feeling on it? After hesitating, Scott told Grogan that his lawyer, Kirk McAllister, had some issues with the DOJ polygrapher, Doug Mansfield. You guys notice the similarities of him and fucking John Ramsey? I don't trust your polygraph dude. He's not one of my guys. How do I know his credentials? It's whatever. I know he's very opposed to Mansfield, but I don't know if he's opposed to somebody else or not. I mean, that would help kind of put some of this stuff to an end, but I don't know. It's something to discuss with him anyways and see what he thinks, Scott said. Changing subjects, Scott began chatting about the media's role in the search for his wife. He also inquired about using a psychic who had contacted him to assist in the search for Lacey. Bueller told Scott that he could not recall a case in the past several years in which a psychic played a role in the recovery of a crime victim. Arriving back at headquarters, Grogan once again suggested that Scott considered taking a polygraph. Scott told the police that the attorney regarded polygraphs as police voodoo. That's motherfucking voodoo, but psychics are legit. The day ended dramatically with Lacey's mother, Sharon Rocha, appearing on CNN's Larry King Live. Lee and Jackie Peterson were also guests on the program. Larry was off that night, and Court TV's Nancy Grace was filling in. I was so excited to do my impression of Nancy Grace, and now I'm all sick. I want to yell. Nancy Grace was filling in. A video clip is so crazy. She was filling in and that shit became monumental. Get him, Nancy Grace. A video clip of Officer Ryden Orr opened the show. We still have hope that Lacey Peterson is out there and alive, he said. And so we think it's critical, and as long as the media wants to continue to cover this, we're going to be here to provide as much information as we can to get community support. Next, Nancy Grace introduced Jackie Peterson. Where is Scott tonight? She asked. I would imagine he would be out begging the viewers to help in the search for his wife. He is, Jackie Peterson told viewers, and he has. And he is with friends this evening and have been searching all day. We go out every day. We have many volunteers. We're headquarters in the Red Lion Inn. And so many nice people and such work, but we need more, and we're not going to give up hope. Grace asked Jackie about the police saying that Scott had cooperated to an extent. Now, what did they mean by that, to an extent? We don't know, Jackie conceded. We don't know what they mean. Has he taken a polygraph? Asked Nancy Grace. I don't know if he's been asked to do that. I don't know if he's been asked to do that. He's been cooperative. He's been made available to them everything they've asked for, Mrs. Peterson responded. Next, Nancy turned to Sharon Rocha. Do they have any leads so far? Anything at all? To the best of our knowledge at this point, there was a robbery and a burglary across the street from their home, Sharon told Nancy. And they've actually made 2 arrests today. We were hoping that they would be connected, but at this point, we're being told that it's not so. Lee Peterson got the final word. "If you knew Scott," he said, "as for him being implicated, it's a non-issue." Okay. Have a good weekend. I figured if Lacey can deal with Scott and his bullshit while being 9 months pregnant, I can read a whole chapter with the flu. Okay, bye.